You and I know value is easily missed. Holden Barrett paid $900 for rusted iron behind an abandoned Columbus, Ohio warehouse. The whole world laughed when the single father hauled this abandoned car prototype home on his beat-up pickup, and CEO Sierra Callaway stood before the press, loudly declaring it a complete failure for everyone. That junk has been dead for 15 years, it will never run again. But 47 nights later, Holden plugged the last cable into a cracked control panel. Just the right person, working alone in a freezing, isolated garage. The pitch-black workshop suddenly lit up blue. A single line of text flashed across the shattered screen, a message that would soon send Asterion Motors spiraling into a deeply desperate, quiet panic. If you love seeing overlooked failures rise up to topple a giant corporate empire, stick with me. Let's watch this unfold together. The salvage auction happened on a bleak November morning at an old testing facility outside Columbus. The exact kind of place that smells like damp concrete and stale motor oil, where chain-link fences silently decay and forgotten history piles up behind loading dock doors nobody opens anymore. Asterion Motors filed the corporate liquidation paperwork 3 weeks prior, calling it a simple consolidation of legacy assets, which was just slick corporate spin for burying their early failures in the trash, long before anyone could ask too many difficult questions about them. The bargain hunters who actually showed up were a rough bunch. Hardened auto scrap dealers and local mechanics hunting for cheap salvage parts. A handful of collectors swapping rusty vintage machinery like normal people trade rare coins. Nobody important, nobody who actually remembered. Holden Barrett pulled in late, leaving his Ford F-250 at the far edge. He wore a torn denim jacket, the left seam busted open, and scuffed work boots that had survived far too many brutal early morning shifts. He was not here hunting for cheap auto parts. He drove 40 minutes because an insider casually tipped him off that this abandoned facility held a mystery electric vehicle frame listed on the auction manifest with 0 model number. No description provided, just a discarded ghost with 0 information. He saw value in that kind of deliberate, total blankness. He found it rotting in the largest warehouse corner, hidden beneath a gray tarp, coated in so much thick dust it had frozen into a rigid shell. Holden peeled the canvas back, and the sight immediately froze him in place. The concept car's body panels were stripped down to bare metal bones. The main control board was severely scorched down one side. Empty battery housing sat useless. It was the skeleton of a machine stripped of everything but pure intention. But Holden immediately recognized the custom dual-loop cooling brackets underneath, the distinct secondary chamber housing along the spine. And he spotted that unmistakable concave curve out back, exactly where the turbine assist module belonged. He had studied those exact engineering curves in a sketch years ago. Late at night, inside a corporate break room reeking of burnt, stale coffee. He was only 28 years old back then. The auctioneer dismissed it as industrial scrap, labeled it a dead failure, asking $500 to start. A few buyers up near the front just laughed. Some guy called it garbage, joking it would make a decent planter minus the roof. Holden stood perfectly still. When bidding stalled at $800, he calmly raised his hand. He bid $900. Nobody followed. The room let out a collective, mocking half-laugh. The sound crowds make when they think a failure is just entertaining them. Holden was signing the paperwork for his abandoned car prototype when Sierra Callaway marched through the side doors. 4 handlers trailing right behind her. A pair of suits, a PR rep, and a guy in a dark coat who clearly wasn't corporate. Sierra was 39, the untouchable CEO running the Asterion Motors startup. Her expression was completely cold and gave 0 clues, but her rigid posture told you everything you needed to know. She showed up to oversee the liquidation sale herself, which tells us one very simple thing. Something in this room held real value. Her gaze locked onto Holden, then shifted to the discarded electric vehicle he just bought. For a second, her mask actually slipped. A quick, completely involuntary flinch before she buried it away. She walked over, asking in a sharp tone that felt more like a threat, questioning if he knew what he bought. Holden simply replied it was a machine waiting to be finished right. Sierra let out a tight breath, speaking up so everyone in the warehouse could hear. That prototype didn't fail because we ran out of good engineers. It failed because it was dead, Nobody is ever bringing that junk back to life. Let them laugh. Holden calmly signed the paper, grabbed his copy, and fetched the tow cables. Driving his truck out of the lot, he never bothered looking back. If he had, he'd have caught Sierra frozen right there in the warehouse doors, staring at the vanishing truck with a look that definitely wasn't disgust. It was the terrified face of someone watching her buried secret start breathing all over again. Marrow Creek was the sort of nowhere town people usually ignore completely. Just a forgotten crossroads between two state highways swallowed up by miles of corn and empty sky. Barrett Mechanical Repair sat on the edge of town, a squat, humble building pushed back behind a dusty gravel lot. The painted metal sign out front was peeling and barely readable. Inside was a garage bay built for 2 vehicles. You could fit them if you parked tight. It had that heavy, permanent smell of old engine oil that soaks into the bones of a place. This was where Holden brought the abandoned car. He unloaded the frame that rainy Tuesday morning. When the metal finally rested onto the cold concrete floor of his quiet shop, the machine looked like it fell from another planet. Travis Nolan, the guy running the parts store 2 blocks away, leaned in the doorway and told Holden to gut the whole thing for scrap metal. Like everyone else, he saw junk, said it could pay for lunch. Holden just smiled, handing him some coffee. Nolan walked off, shaking his head at the fool. His 14-year-old daughter, Maddie, wandered into the shop after school. She stood there staring down the ruined chassis, giving it that exact look you give a mystery you cannot solve. She asked why he wasted their tight budget on a busted heap of metal. Holden looked at her. He said just because the world throws something away doesn't mean its story is over. Maddie weighed those words, then went inside to start making dinner. Here is the thing. Holden worked at Asterion 15 years ago. He wasn't the big boss. His name never flashed across those shiny press releases. He was a quiet systems guy, totally invisible to the executives stamping their own names on the golden patents. When the prototype got killed, the company blamed some massive testing failure on the official record, and a certain name was buried inside the internal files. Hidden in the fine print, it was Holden's name, because he was the only one who saw the real issue, warning them 2 weeks prior. The truth was acknowledged, then buried. Naturally, none of it reached the official corporate record. 2 years later, his wife walked away without any drama. Just in the slow, quiet way of someone realizing a life built on chaotic uncertainty simply wasn't what they signed up for. Holden never blamed her once. He raised Maddie, ran his repair shop, and buried the Asterion name completely, until the morning an RX-1 prototype showed up on a liquidation notice. Picture this. His first night alone in the shop with the discarded machine. Holden pulled back the tarp, running calloused hands along the stripped, cold chassis. The fading Asterion logo on the side panel had oxidized into a hollow ghost. He spoke softly, talking to no one but the broken prototype. "The world called you a failure," he whispered. "They never let you finish your sentence." Grabbing his notebook, he started cataloging parts. The first major discovery took less than an hour. The core structure was perfectly intact, unbent, unwarped. The damage looked severe but was entirely superficial. Someone had systematically stripped it, deliberately hollowing it out. But the bones remained solid. You wouldn't expect that from a supposedly failed electric vehicle that destroyed itself in a catastrophic crash test. Holden kept working until 2 in the morning, when he finally set his heavy tools down. Snapping photos of the interior control housing, he spotted a tiny adhesive label hidden inside the port bay cover. Yellowed but clear, it read RX-1 Unit 03, final trial not completed. Holden froze in absolute silence. This wasn't the automotive prototype that had tragically failed. This was a discarded machine that was never actually tested at all. Meanwhile, Asterion Motors occupied 12 gleaming floors of glass over in Chicago's West Loop, the kind of corporate fortress that projected immense power through sheer, cold transparency. While Holden Barrett was carefully loading the forgotten RX-1 onto his flatbed in Marrow Creek, CEO Sierra Callaway stood in a sterile boardroom aggressively pitching a $2.4 billion product strategy to elite investors who had watched her tech company fall behind rivals for most of a decade. Her pitch was flawlessly precise, confident, and delivered without a single hesitation. 2 hours after the auction closed, a junior associate brought news. The worthless RX-1 was bought by a former employee named Holden Barrett. a guy who actually served on the original engineering support team. Sierra asked whether the liquidation contract legally prohibited any future restoration. Her legal director explained that since the prototype was auctioned off as pure scrap, physical ownership had transferred completely. However, software architecture, patents, and all test data remained Asterion's exclusive property. The physical machine was his. Sierra ordered her team to monitor him quietly. At the executive board meeting 2 days later, Von Mercer expressed visible irritation. He snapped at Sierra, calling her reckless for letting that unit reach a public auction. Sierra calmly insisted the unit was non-operational. It lacked the main activation core, plus that elusive cold start sequence only one single engineer had ever possessed in complete form. Mercer locked eyes with her, dropping a comment that hung strangely in the silent boardroom. "It doesn't matter if that car runs," he warned. "What matters is keeping it hidden." But think about it. That sentence carried a heavy weight completely unrelated to mechanics. Meanwhile, a grainy cell phone video from the auction showed Holden hooking a tow cable to the RX-1 while the crowd simply stared. That clip started circulating across regional technology forums. The online reactions were predictably cruel. But we know better. A small-town single father bought a sleeping prototype for under $1,000. The CEO called this prototype worthless, but you and I know better. Whitney Boone, an indie tech journalist over in Cincinnati. She caught a video clip Thursday, instantly recognizing the RX-1. She tried digging into its history twice, both times dead ends. Just an old name, some early 2000s announcements, and then total silence. A completely wiped slate, so she drove out to Merrow Creek. I turned her away twice. I didn't want cameras highlighting my scrapped car. I just wanted to fix this broken machine, not be famous. But Whitney showed up a third time, holding something real. She finally found a name. Gideon Hart, a lead engineer from the original discarded project. In 2011, he emailed a trade magazine, claiming the project was unfairly killed off. He insisted their amazing test numbers were hidden, never released publicly. Hearing Gideon's name, I froze, a much deeper silence than my usual single-dad quiet. Meanwhile, the CEO got a photo from the corporate spy watching my rusty shop. I had opened the prototype's core. Sierra texted her fixer 2 words. He replied quickly, giving an order she instantly passed along. Get it back before he finds the second core. I drove to Gideon's small, forgotten house on the edge of Dayton. From the outside, the guy clearly stopped caring about yard work decades ago. Inside was totally different, walls lined with labeled boxes. Drafting tables, old graph paper, and technical manuals perfectly sorted by the decade. The air smelled like old paper and decades of deep, serious thinking, real ignored genius. Gideon was 71, he spoke slowly, like a man who spent his whole life making sure every single measurement was perfect. He opened his front door, staring at me like a complete stranger. But when I whispered Unit 03, everything shifted in his tired eyes. He pulled the door wide open, brewed coffee. Before anything else, he asked if I truly grasped the immense value I uncovered. It's not just the discarded car that wakes up, he warned. The people who buried it do too. I told him I was ready. Gideon set down his mug, explaining. My abandoned prototype was never just a basic electric car. They actually built a micro-turbine regenerative hybrid drive inside this thing. A tiny gas turbine that didn't drive the wheels directly. Instead, it endlessly recharged a compressed energy buffer, pushing the range way beyond what any modern electric battery could ever handle. Early tests showed efficiency levels the auto industry still cannot touch even today. The real issue was timing and greed. Back in 2006, the board chased a massive battery manufacturer partnership. Hundreds of millions, fully betting on large lithium packs as the only future. If my discarded RX-1 succeeded in public road testing, let's think about this together. It would expose their massive pivot as pure greed, not true innovation. So they trashed 3 built units. Unit 01 caught fire during early tests and was completely destroyed. Unit 02 was permanently scrapped. People called Unit 03 a dud. It never even finished a full trial. But it was perfectly ready. The testing date was locked in. Just 12 minutes before the sequence was supposed to start, the executives ordered a hard stop. It was never lifted. Holden wanted to know why Callaway labeled the machine worthless. Gideon answered without hesitating. If it runs, then 15 years of decisions become 15 years of lies. Gideon reached under his heavy drafting table, pulling out a battered cardboard mailing tube. It held a few sheets of technical drawings detailing the dual-loop cooling system, along with the secondary control core layout fully sketched, drawn by someone who knew every single detail by heart before the pen even touched paper. Crucial blueprints, yet far from complete. The one missing link was the cold start activation code. A complex software chain needed to wake the turbine without tripping the battery buffer's built-in fail-safe alarms. Without those commands, firing up the turbine meant risking total destruction of the drive system. Only one living person ever held the full version of that software. The old software lead for the project, Dorian Blake. And he hadn't touched the auto industry since 2010. At the doorway, Gideon grabbed Holden by the arm. Don't restore it like a car. Restore it like raw testimony. Holden headed straight back to Marrow Creek, pinned the blueprints across his shop wall, and just stared at the massive challenge ahead. Reinforcing the frame, auxiliary power, rebuilding cooling loops. The turbine priming setup, the core, and that missing cold start code. He grabbed his oily notebook and just started right at the top. You and I know real restoration isn't some quick, easy movie montage. It was weeks of brutal, frustrating labor in a freezing garage. He had awful tools and a budget that demanded pure, stubborn creativity. Holden tracked down a used, recycled, industrial-grade cooling pump from an abandoned food plant 40 miles out. He hand-wound coils using raw copper ripped from an old generator. He carved custom mounts on an ancient CNC machine. Its manual was printed in a font no one even recognizes today. By day, he kept the shop running with oil changes, brakes, and alignments. Then he wrestled with the RX-1 from sunset until his bruised hands literally refused to hold a wrench. Maddie learned exactly which late nights required absolute silence. She would quietly set a dinner plate on the edge of the workbench nearest to the RX-1, saying nothing. An hour later, Holden would finally notice it, still warm. As he dug deeper into the guts, he found something. He uncovered a truth he had quietly suspected but dreaded proving right away. The main wiring harness was cleanly sliced, not frayed, not rusted out. Sliced at 3 specific points hidden in spots that only made sense. To an engineer who intimately understood the machine's internal brain. Let's look at what that means. Someone purposely rigged this brilliant machine to stage its own tragic death. Around week 4, a local TV crew filmed a short pity piece. Single father blows last savings on a totally impossible prototype. A former Asterion operations manager smugly declared on the broadcast that if the company's entire engineering team couldn't make the RX-1 work, then some lone mechanic in rural Ohio stood absolutely no chance. At a Detroit tech panel, Sierra Callaway flashed a highly practiced, corporate smile when asked about Holden before saying, "Engineering does not run on hope." The world swore this abandoned EV prototype would never drive itself again. That brutal quote made headlines, permanently stamping Holden's reputation onto a massive, highly publicized automotive failure. Whitney returned to his garage, asking once more if she could film even a small fraction of this car restoration. Holden initially refused. He wouldn't turn his misunderstood electric vehicle into cheap entertainment. Yet after Asterion's public smear, Whitney pointed out something that truly resonated. If they're allowed to paint you as completely delusional, you deserve the right to show everyone the hidden value you're actually building. He granted her limited access, no deep tech specs, no tight shots of internal hardware. Stick with me here. Near day 31, Holden tweaked a backup relay sequence and the dead dashboard sparked alive. 3 seconds, maybe 4 max. The forgotten Asterion startup logo flashed on the shattered center screen, pale blue against pitch black, then dying out again. He rocked back on his tired heels, finally letting out a long, heavy breath. 2 days later, a threatening legal notice arrived via certified mail. Asterion Motors formally demanded he stop every single piece of restoration work involving their proprietary software code right away, under severe threat of civil lawsuits. Holden silently read the letter 3 times. He tossed it onto the workbench corner, exactly where his daughter Maddie always left his late-night dinner. Then he marched right back to the rejected car and grabbed his wrench. Asterion's next strike was personal. One morning, a corporate suit named Mallory Quinn rolled into the shop driving a spotless luxury sedan. too pristine for the gravel lot, introducing herself as head corporate legal counsel. She warned that waking up any hidden proprietary software meant stealing Asterion's highly valuable intellectual property. Then she offered him $25,000 for the chassis, demanding an immediate transfer, plus signing a strict non-disclosure agreement. 25 grand is massive for a single dad who's 3 months late on heavy equipment loans. Holden quietly studied the printed offer sheet. You and I have to wonder, why was a supposedly dead machine worth 25 grand to those who dumped it for 900? Mallory coldly replied she wasn't authorized to explain their secret pricing formulas. Holden politely thanked her. She drove off. Within 10 days, the corporate squeeze became incredibly targeted. The bank suddenly called regarding his equipment loan. A vital commercial repair contract he desperately needed for winter got abruptly canceled without any reason. His main auto parts supplier abruptly told him his specific account was shifting to strict prepayment only. Whitney dug into the paper trail. She exposed a shadow holding company with clear financial ties to a massive fund managed by Von Mercer. They had just bought a controlling stake in the supplier's parent brand. The crushing pressure was squeezing him from afar, leaving absolutely zero fingerprints behind. Holden sat alone in the dark garage that night, past due bills piled high, staring at the unfinished car just 3 feet away. Maddie walked in around 10 p.m. She quietly dropped his dusty, Asterion-era engineering notebook right on the messy workbench before him. She'd discovered it hidden in a closet box months ago, but had kept completely quiet about it until tonight. She softly admitted she couldn't comprehend most of the complex, technical scribbles inside. But she noticed that whenever he stared at the discarded car, he never just looked like a mechanic fixing a broken machine. We've all been there. He looked like a man desperately hunting for a brilliant piece of himself he'd left behind and lost. She simply whispered goodnight and walked back into the quiet house. Holden opened that old notebook. He definitely wasn't selling now. The break-in went down just 3 nights later. His homemade motion alarm, just a basic pressure pad on the shop door, nothing fancy but crazy loud, screamed to life at 1:40 a.m. By the time he sprinted into the garage, the trespasser had already vanished. They had picked the door lock clean and fast. Someone had ripped a data port module right out of the inner control bay. A tiny car part, sure, but it connected to the diagnostic memory banks. Good thing Holden photographed every single inch during reassembly. He still held the schematics, he hadn't lost his grip. Scanning the security footage, he caught one clear frame by the back wall. The intruder turned, perfectly exposing a specific corporate logo on their jacket. A maintenance crew he easily recognized from those old Asterion vendor files. You and I know this wasn't just a simple restoration anymore. This was an outright war, and only the giant corporation knew it yet. Holden tried calling Dorian Blake, the former software team lead. The guy who originally coded the cold start sequence. 7 calls, dead silence. On attempt number 7, he dropped a single voicemail. My name is Holden Barrett. I have Unit 03 sitting in my Ohio shop. They called it scrap, but I need your truth to wake it up. Exactly 3 days later, a blocked number finally rang back. Dorian was 61, speaking in that clipped, guarded tone of a man who spent years treating his words like a shield against corporate lawyers. He warned Holden to drop it. He admitted the RX-1 wasn't scrapped because of some alleged mechanical flaw. He confessed that the final simulation run on Unit 03 before track testing had delivered efficiency numbers that absolutely smashed every single benchmark. It was so advanced it made the CEO's entire future technology roadmap look like an absolute joke. The brutal choice to cancel the physical road test had happened mere hours after those record-breaking results hit the big boss's desk. Holden demanded to know why Dorian stayed silent for 15 years. A heavy pause followed. Dorian admitted that he signed a harsh gag order under the very real threat of a corporate lawsuit that would bankrupt him overnight. He had kids, a hefty mortgage, and he was completely terrified. Then he dropped a line that changed everything. But I never deleted the code. I couldn't do it. My entire engineering team poured their souls into that system. I refused to trash our masterpiece just because some clueless executive labeled it an inconvenience. He tossed the single father a crucial lifeline. He promised to explain the cold start sequence's raw logic over the phone. But first, he needed proof Holden wasn't some amateur who'd accidentally blow the prized turbine to pieces. Without missing a single beat, Holden explained the tricky reverse cooling cycle perfectly. He nailed the exact valve timing to wake the turbine. Stick with me here. He even knew how to hide the battery shutoff signal during early ignition. When he wrapped up, Dorian sighed. Gideon was absolutely right. You're the only guy left who sees the genius hiding inside this forgotten machine. A secure physical hard drive hit his mailbox a few days later. It held the full startup code, packed with safety notes on every possible failure state. Dorian also buried a hidden data file inside, tagged with just one ominous warning. You need to realize exactly what else you are waking up. You and I know trash holds treasure. The file detailed a passive archiving protocol Gideon forced into the RX-1 core. They internally tagged it the Black Orchard Protocol. If I use the prototype's original activation core to wake this rejected system, the setup would automatically compile and broadcast the entire hidden log, including every scrapped simulation file, every executive memo tied to the project, plus a record of every single command sent to this brilliant machine during its final hours awake. That explains Sierra demanding the second core. It wasn't spare garbage, it was a silent witness. I crawled back into the control bay, reaching blindly behind the thermal foam on the left wall. I found the hidden module right where Dorian's documents promised it hid. A tiny metal component wrapped up in protective foam. Scrawled across the front in faded ink, Orchard do not remove. I pulled up the history on my laptop, checking Gideon's internal Asterion timeline for clues. And there was the exact entry I both dreaded and expected. Final dynamic test RX-10 scheduled for 9:15 a.m. Cancelled at 9:03 a.m. Authorization. Sierra Callaway. She was vice president of strategic development back then. 12 minutes. They bought 15 years of silence in 12 minutes. Night 47 froze. Temperatures plunged into the mid-20s. My garage heater fought hard just to keep the air survivable. I had been grinding for 31 of the last 36 hours. My hands were dead steady in that weird, specific way. They calm down when you are just too exhausted to feel nervous anymore. Gideon was there. He drove up that afternoon, moving slowly but helping. Whitney stood over by the door with her camera ready. Dorian stayed on a secure line from Montana. His voice drifted over the low speaker, giving us periodic murmurs of confirmation. You know that heavy feeling before surgery? My shop felt exactly like that. Dead quiet, heavy with the pressure of waking a discarded masterpiece. I handled every single step without rushing. I pressurized the cooling loop, checking for leaks before feeding this rejected beauty any real power. I eased the auxiliary power online at a fraction of its capacity. I slipped the board into maintenance mode, skipping their purposely corrupted startup files. I fed it the cold start sequence, verified the checksum, and locked the injection timing. I completely disconnected the failsafe relay that would misread this beast's early ignition cycle as a total flaw. I plugged the Orchard module straight into the diagnostic port. Then I began the turbine's thermal precycle, just a slow, low speed spin to push oil that had sat completely dead in the housing for 15 years. The first startup attempt failed almost instantly. A heat warning blasted from sensor array 4. The system shut down before reaching operational speed. Attempt 2 saw the auxiliary battery voltage tank way below the required threshold. On try 3, my entire garage lost power for several very dark seconds. Gideon muttered that we should consider quitting. But I was already on my back under the control bay, tracing the wiring harness until I felt it. A wire flipped at the junction block. Not broken, it was purposely reversed. Stick with me. Someone sabotaged this masterpiece after scrapping it. Someone had quietly swapped 2 wires in the temperature circuit, guaranteeing any cold start would fail before the abandoned car prototype even reached operating condition. They left absolutely no obvious trace. But the single dad saw its worth, rewiring the junction. He reset the main board and ran the precycle again. Stick with me. At 2:16 in the morning, night 47, he fired it up. First came the sharp sound of relays clicking in rapid succession. Then the forgotten turbine housing let out an incredibly unique noise. It was something between a breath and a hum, a deep, rich, and sustained tone. The sound of abandoned metal parts, frozen for 15 years, finally remembering their true geometry again. Suddenly, the instrument panel lit up in bright blue-white. The cracked screen on the dashboard flickered from dull gray static past the Asterion logo, settling into something completely new and alive. A crisp status readout appeared, an RX-1 Unit 3 Final Trial Mode active variable. The written-off turbine purred into idle. Temperature readouts were perfectly stable. The old auxiliary battery actually held. The cooling system flowed. Every discarded component was awake and reporting. Holden watched the data stream in, feeling a heavy weight vanish from his chest. A stubborn tension finally letting go, the way a joint locked up for years suddenly gives. His son Gideon didn't quite cry, he just blinked hard, pressing one hand firmly against his knee. Whitney stood silently near the door, her camera rolling steadily. From the phone speaker, Dorian Blake's stunned voice drifted out after a heavy pause. "It remembers the way home." Once the Orchard module finished its handshake, a completely new line popped on the screen. Archived executive hold order was finally detected. The massive archive had loaded. Meanwhile, in Chicago, a tracking app on CEO Sierra Callaway's phone caught an activation signal from a discarded legacy identifier she hadn't seen in 15 years. She bolted upright in the dark and immediately called Von Mercer. She spoke just 3 words, it came on. The quick startup video Whitney posted the next morning lasted under 10 seconds. It only showed the beautiful blue dashboard glow, alongside the faint, steady purr of the idling turbine. It reached a massive audience by noon and became a viral sensation by evening. Tech sites grabbed the story while automotive forums dissected every frame. You and I are probably wondering the exact same thing those forums asked. If it couldn't run, why is it running? Asterion Motors scrambled to respond within 48 hours. They released a formal statement calling the RX-1 a dangerous, unvalidated legacy electric prototype. The CEO went on television, framing her dismissive words with careful, fake concern. She claimed a machine that lights up is not a machine that runs. That arrogant statement settled things for Holden. He verified with a lawyer that firing up the prototype on his own private property, without selling their proprietary software, was fully protected under his rights as physical owner. He'd built his own startup bridge anyway, relying solely on Dorian's brilliant verbal logic. He had every legal right to show the world what this rejected machine could do. He gave the public exactly 72 hours of notice, an entirely open invitation, welcoming journalists, engineers, regular folks, and even Asterion Motors themselves if they dared to show. We're about to see the payoff. For 3 days straight, Holden barely slept. He braced the broken undercarriage and swapped out the rotted tires. He rigged up a separate data tracker, ironclad proof of its worth that nobody could call fake. Then he wired an external kill switch just to be completely safe. One night, he stood facing the worthless prototype and peeled off, the rusted, cracked Asterion badge still clinging to the side panel. He wiped it down gently, didn't toss it, didn't reattach it either. Propping it against the front tire, he told Gideon, "I won't erase their name. I want them to see the exact masterpiece they threw away." The night before the run, the CEO showed up completely alone. She lingered by the door, hands buried in her coat, staring down the very machine she called garbage. She warned Holden he had no idea what he was unleashing. Not just firing up an engine, but the fallout if this outcast actually worked. Corporate stock, factory deals, massive contracts, and workers' pensions. She claimed he was gambling with all those lives, treating their survival like a stubborn personal crusade. Holden just looked at her. He said she made the truth dangerous. That she buried a brilliant invention out of pure fear and forced the world to believe her lie about it. For 15 long years, Sierra froze and snapped, "You think you're just starting a car? You are burning down my company." Holden shook his head. "No, I'm lighting up a room you locked away years ago." She walked out, but right at the edge of the dark lot, she paused, staring through the open door at the scrapped prototype one final time. Her face betrayed a raw, haunting regret she had kept buried for over a decade. Picture this with me. The morning of the test was freezing, the kind of bitter chill that makes every exhaled breath visible. Out at the Marrow Creek circuit, an old tractor testing loop behind a local farm where the owners kindly let them set up. The dirt track was packed 4 or 5 people deep. The turnout was way bigger than anyone ever expected. Tech experts, mechanics, locals, auto reporters who drove all night, plus rogue engineers who watched the viral footage and needed to see this underdog machine with their own eyes. Down by the starting line, the corporate executives stood totally isolated. Van Mercer in a heavy coat, 2 lawyers and a PR director clutching a tablet, and Sierra Callaway keeping a quiet distance from her team. A totally independent inspector named Archer Hayes, brought in through a national board, carrying zero ties to the automaker or the father. He checked the rejected car yesterday and gave full clearance to the track's entire safety setup. When Van Mercer tried stopping the whole event, claiming it was a massive public hazard, Hayes just flashed his signed papers. They had no legal right to stop this. Holden climbed inside the car. The cabin was tight and raw, exposed wires tangled across every single surface. A scrap dashboard built from factory parts and custom hacks. The main display was smashed in the corner, but glowing perfectly. He strapped on the harness, hit the power, and the forgotten prototype lurched forward. You know that agonizing suspense? The first 20 meters crept so slow the crowd held their breath, expecting a spectacular failure. Its internal turbine hummed, barely even audible. Then the main transmission kicked in. The written-off turbine hit its sweet spot. The sound shifted, pure, deep, and steady. The rejected car launched forward. That first lap passed flawlessly. Heat levels across both systems stayed 10% under redline. By lap 2, the regenerative brakes were actively feeding power back into the battery. Not in theory, but in reality, pushing numbers way past the original design specs. Stick with me, lap 3. Holden pushed the speedometer exactly where those old, forgotten test parameters demanded. He kept it pinned down the entire backstretch of the track. Then he braked smoothly, dumping another massive, measurable wave of electricity straight back into the grid. He rolled to a halt at the starting line. The masterpiece engine settled into a purr. The abandoned prototype just sat there. The audience stood in absolute stunned silence. Slowly, a murmur rippled through the crowd from every direction. Nobody was cheering yet. It was pure collective shock wearing off entirely. Archer Hayes marched straight up to the car before anyone else moved, studying the external data readouts. He turned to the closest onlookers and muttered that if this data holds up, this discarded tech is 10 years ahead of anything on the market. The data was flawless. Then the Orchard software finished its final sync. All records transferred to the backup drives. Whitney and Gideon had rigged up right before the test. Now look closely with me. The main screen swapped from metrics to text. Whitney quickly linked the feed to a portable projector near the scoreboard. The words flashed massive. Everyone in that crowd could clearly see the truth. Unit 03 final simulation stat. Performance metrics beating baseline by 31%. Executive stop order issued. Internal reasoning logged. RX-1 Triumph threatens their current tech investments. Full authorization to kill the project entirely. Signed, Sierra Callaway. Financial review demanding the permanent burial of this breakthrough. Signed, Von Mercer. The timeline was precise and the ink undeniable. Reporters instantly spun their lenses toward the Asterion executives. Von Mercer bolted for the parking lot, but the press swallowed him within 15 steps. Sierra stood there, completely frozen. She stared at the glowing truth on the wall, totally and utterly speechless. Gideon waded into the densest part of the crowd. With a trembling but steady voice, he swore that every leaked file showing this car's true value was authentic. Dorian Blake popped up on Whitney's phone screen. He verified the cold start sequence, backed up the data drop, and declared that the electric vehicle prototype wasn't scrapped for failing. It was killed because its success threatened their wallets. Holden finally climbed out of the RX-1. He was covered in grease from tweaking the engine bay at 6 that morning. No victory laps, no grand gestures, he just stood beside his vindicated masterpiece and waited. One reporter shouted, asking if he planned to sue Asterion Motors into the ground. Holden shook his head calmly. He didn't bring this machine here to ruin anybody. He brought it out because for 15 long years, they labeled this miracle a failure. He just needed to let the truth finally speak for its damn self today. The supposedly worthless RX-1 sat center stage, its turbine purring softly at an idle. The discarded Asterion badge leaned against the front tire, catching the crisp morning sun perfectly. You and I both know the world changed after that. You know how fast things change? It felt like lightning to us working quietly behind the scenes. Major technology publications carried our story. Auto industry analysts debated how massive engineering firms could blindly toss such brilliant work away. Asterion stock tanked 17% in the first 3 days. Von Mercer quit before the board could formally kick him out for missing the treasure. The CEO, Sierra Callaway, was suspended pending a regulatory review. Whitney published a much deeper, revealing report, uncovering the financial greed driving Asterion's terrible decision. It exposed how much Mercer's own wealth relied entirely on keeping that bad partnership as the firm's main focus, and exactly how. Burying the RX-1 prototype wasn't about protecting the company at all. It just protected one man's wallet while sacrificing true innovation. The proof emerged from forgotten archives, Dorian's files, and corporate records that finally saw the light. 6 weeks after our test, Sierra Callaway asked to meet me privately. She showed up alone at my shop on a Tuesday afternoon. She explained to me that back when the hold order happened, she was 31, genuinely believing that protecting the company's path meant the exact same thing as protecting the people working for her. She said she convinced herself burying the RX-1 was a necessary sacrifice. She repeated that excuse to herself so often and with such fierce consistency that she eventually started to see it as the absolute truth. I just listened. I told her she hadn't just buried a machine. She looked Gideon, Dorian, and the whole team in the eye and called their brilliant creation completely worthless. She convinced them they were utter failures. And then she spent 15 years growing her empire on the grave of their perceived failure. Sierra just sat there. She said, "I know." Multiple buyout offers arrived soon after. I handled every single corporate inquiry with the exact same demands. Stick with me here. I demanded 3 hard conditions before signing anything. First, Gideon Hart and Dorian Blake must be officially recognized as the founding engineers of the RX-1 program across all public records. Second, all of the vehicle's test data had to be submitted to an independent audit board before we even discussed commercial licensing deals. Third, whoever commercialized the RX-1 technology had to establish a funded support program for every engineer and technician who lost their jobs when the project was trashed in 2009. My terms were absolutely non-negotiable, and they were met. By the following spring, my little shop in Marrow Creek still rocked the exact same painted sign on that faded metal frame. Inside, it still smelled like motor oil and hard work. But right behind the main bay, through a door that definitely wasn't there last year, sat an entirely new structure, a clean, bright testing lab built from private grants. It was packed with the exact kind of gear that made Gideon Hart smile when he finally saw it. You and I know true value doesn't need a fancy name. I left the building blank. Gideon would drive up from Dayton twice a month, sit at the workbench, and casually solve problems. And the young engineers who came to work alongside me listened to him the way you listen to someone who held on to the truth through a 15-year silence. Dorian Blake finally returned to active engineering for the first time in 15 years. Backed by an independent research crew chasing real engine efficiency. Journalist Whitney Boone dropped an 8-month series that won major national awards. But whenever someone asked her about the scoop, she flipped it. The real story wasn't about the scandal she dug up. She said it was about a discarded machine finally speaking its truth. Cut to the regional engineering conference that same fall. They didn't hide the RX-1 behind velvet ropes. It sat there completely raw, exactly as it was found. Scratched up, patched by hand, that old Asterion logo propped against the tire just how Holden left it. The former CEO Sierra Callaway showed up quietly, no VIP badge, no title. Just another face in the crowd. She watched that worthless RX-1's data light up the main screen during the technical presentation. Out in the hallway afterward, she crossed paths with Holden. He nodded, she just nodded back. No dramatic apologies for the crowd, just 2 people sharing the same space, the bad blood finally gone. If you and I had tracked this whole saga, that quiet moment was all the closure we needed. His daughter Maddie sat in the 3rd row that afternoon, a notebook resting open on her lap. A nearby grad student whispered, asking if she was related to the guy who saved the prototype. Maddie quietly said yes. The student called it incredible, asking what it felt like watching him pull that off. Maddie paused, then told him her dad didn't rebuild that car for revenge. He saved it because he simply couldn't abandon a machine that still had so much left to give. That night he took the RX-1 to the test road one last time. No flashy press demo, no chasing a speed record. The sun sank low behind the western trees, painting the flat dirt track in deep orange light. And the turbine just purred, steady and calm like two old friends chatting. Gideon hung back by the edge of the road, watching. Whitney had her camera, but kept the lens down. Miles away in Montana, Dorian listened to that sweet engine hum through a phone pressed against his ear. Holden finished the loop and parked right at the starting line, letting the engine sit there idling. The digital dash flashed the custom status code he typed in, right before the big engineering conference. Right where the factory tag used to be, it just read Rexonat Alive. He finally killed the engine. The turbine slowly spun down, the hot metal ticking and settling into the quiet dark. Holden just sat there in the silence. He thought about the $900, the 47 nights, and the 12 minutes that stole 15 years from decent people. Then he exhaled, long and slow, the heavy breath of a man finally dropping a burden he had carried for far too long. Some machines are simply never built to be sold. Some just need one run to show you and me exactly who was lying when they labeled them a total failure.